Turn back the clocks 20 plus years, and Grant Morrison is out the back of a San Diego Comic-Con, ironing out some writer's block with DC editor Dan Raspler concerning Superman. Time and again, DC's flagship character had been given the reboot treatment, his origin in his early years wheeled out and redone for a new generation of readers. And here Morrison, one of the key figures of the British invasion of the 80s, was trying to do more of the same. Everything changed when Morrison's eye caught, of all things, a cosplayer having some downtime, a random guy in Superman garb, sitting about, cool as a cucumber, not a care in the world. And that's when it hit Morrison. If you were near indestructible like Superman, of course you'd be relaxed. You've got nothing to fear bar some minute fragments of your home planet most people don't even have access to. That one moment of inspiration sparked an instant classic. All-Star Superman. Far from a reboot, far away from another tired old retelling of an origin story everyone already knows. All-Star Superman zeroes in on quite the opposite, following Superman in his closing months, as he slowly dies of a degenerative cell death affliction from quite literally flying too close to the sun. And perhaps the thought of Superman getting his affairs in order before he croaks sounds miserable. But this bright and hopeful comic is anything but, blending modern sensibilities and wit with the hectic sci-fi and upbeat heroics of the Silver Age of superhero comics. Usually agreed to have begun in 1956, the Silver Age came hot off the heels of what has constantly been a thorn in the side of entertainment from generation to generation: needless censorship. A whole bunch of no-good busybodies had the gall to go ahead and blame the medium of comic books for those no-good rotten kids, that ever-present issue of misbehaving youth. It's so easy to blame entertainment for something like juvenile crime, because it means you don't have to turn away from the screen and pinpoint what's really wrong at home instead. Just skirt over it, dust it, throw it under the bed. Anyways, for superhero comics, this proved to be surprisingly fantastic news, actually, as publishers hedged their bets on the light and bright good versus evil morality of masked men and caped crusaders, to keep the medium chugging along under the watchful eye of the Comics Code Authority, who'd had more than enough of all the crime, horror, and romance stuff out there. In lieu of shock value and dark subject matter, writers and artists were allowed to let their more fantastical ideas run wild, injecting the heroes of DC with a sense of adventurous whimsy and wonder in the process. Far from bleak and gritty, characters were typically brimming with hope and positivity. Realism was on an indefinite hiatus, and the heavy-handed antics of social commentary were largely absent. In their place, readers were treated to a joyful mode of escapism, capturing the uplifting sense of hope stories of heroes pulling off impossible feats can bring. Fast forward all the way to 2005, and that sense of innocent joy was long buried. In All-Star Superman, despite a bleak premise on paper, readers of an entirely new age of storytelling were treated to some of that Silver Age fun. Watching the mighty Kal-El step forward as an unabashedly noble, relentlessly selfless hero committed to protecting the innocent at all costs. The Superman of All-Star Superman is an enlightenment-focused take on the character, a wise and emotionally mature protagonist, typically a few steps ahead of everyone else. Everyone else, that is, bar Lex Luthor, but we'll get to that in a bit. Superman is all but flawless, a near-perfect man in his personality, his intellect, his morality, and of course his ridiculous super strength, where zero effort is made to even vaguely humanize his utterly absurd powers. With the story instead choosing to shamelessly celebrate the outright ridiculousness of a man who can overhead press 1 quintillion tons like it's not even that much. Far from the dark and dour tone of his work for Vertigo in the years prior, or his ultimately grim run on the X-Men, during which an incensed, insane Magneto went full mass murderer in New York, Morrison's work here is a stark reminder of his quiet mastery of optimistic, often charming storytelling. Not only is Superman a beacon of hope, an almost messianic figure from which the Earth he protects draws inspiration and courage, but the world he inhabits is energetic and vibrant in its own right. Morrison's bright and infallible take on DC's flagship protagonist is greatly enhanced by the slick and richly detailed penciling of longtime collaborator Frank Quitely. Frank Quitely. Frank Quitely. That artist will be here all day with me trying to figure that one out. This artist's deep understanding of anatomy, thrupled with his sharp eye for dynamic page compositions and interest in subtle surrealism, infuses Morrison's writing with an eye-catching, cinematic aesthetic. Throughout his lengthy career as a highly sought-after penciler in the industry, Quitely has set himself apart with his natural aptitude for bringing the power and often imposing physicality of superheroes to the page, providing a sense of weight and scale to their often wild, fantastical antics. His pencils are brought to sharper, more vibrant life than ever before, thanks to the high-tech colouring of Jamie Grant. Grant is, in many ways, an underrated, unsung hero in the comic books medium, displaying a remarkable knack for capturing dynamic lighting and depth, contrasting bright landscapes with distinctive personal shadowing to bring Quitely's characters to vivid life against their heady, surreal backdrops. Grant's work is a neat showcase of where the sometimes controversial world of digital colouring can take these stories, layering them with rich colour palettes and textures that enhance the atmosphere of the storytelling on hand. I'll tell you, I've read this comic a few times. I've read a lot of comics by Grant Morrison, many of which had Frank Quitely's pencils done on them, and for some reason, I've seen this man's name on paper thousands of times. I've never thought actually how you'd say it out loud. Shocking. Just shocking. In this video, I'll be dissecting several key aspects of this story, including the characterizations of Superman and Lex Luthor, the 12 Labors plotline that runs through the whole story, Superman's more personal human moments with characters such as Lois Lane and Jonathan Kent, and what the story itself has to say on the mythology and thematic value of superheroes in storytelling as a whole. If you somehow managed to watch long enough, feel free to tell me how I did. The narrative kicks off with Superman flying out into space to save the day when the first manned mission to the sun, shockingly, goes wrong. Who could have possibly thought that might be a dangerous idea? But here we are with Leo Quinton, a truly absurd caricature of the average comic book super genius, looking to actually scoop a sun sample to bring home to Earth, completely skirting over the many, just way too many to list ways, that would be catastrophically improbable. Unfortunately, Quintum's ship, which can somehow withstand the heat of the sun up close, very impressive, malfunctions, and it of course falls to the Man of Steel to save the day, something he does with relative ease to kick the saga off on a high note. Unfortunately, their ship, which can somehow withstand the heat of the sun up close, very impressive, has a little doo-doo. It turns out one of the crew members is actually a bum, in human form, quite literally. And it of course falls to the Man of Steel to save the day, something he does with relative ease to kick the saga off on a high note. There's just one problem. This whole catastrophe was orchestrated by that dastardly Lex Luthor in order to dupe Superman into spending too much time being way too close to the sun. And where a human being would just be ash, Superman's very cells, normally powered by solar energy, have entered a severe state of overload. His body is so chock full of what the sun has to offer that it's actually dying off, with Superman's supervision allowing him to watch his own cells die and disintegrate in real time. The clock on his mortality just started to tick. And from there, with 12 issues on hand, we follow Superman as he moves through his very own rendition of the 12 Labors, far away from the ordeals Hercules once went through, but thematically connected all the same. Before we get into that, though, it's time to unwrap Lex Luthor. Grant Morrison and co. do a sterling job of bringing a pure and noble Superman to the page in this story, and that's all well and good in a world of fantastical optimism. Bringing out a classically well-meaning lead protagonist really should go without saying. However, depicting evil in a way that is both effective and suitably villainous, whilst also balancing out with the general warm tone of Silver Age storytelling, is no easy feat. Morrison introduces us to a Lex Luthor who is largely defeated and past his prime, a far cry from the smirking billionaire putting Superman and Metropolis through the ringer. Luthor has been busted and arrested, and by the time readers meet him, he's rotting in prison where he belongs, used as a scientific asset by the US government thanks to his sky-high intellect. This take on the character peels back the layers of his damaged, often manic psyche, shedding the skin of the confident evil genius to reveal a deeply insecure and emotionally fractured figure. For all of his wits and his accomplishments, it quickly becomes clear that this Luthor is tormented internally by the cold hard fact that he will never, ever measure up to Superman. Not only will he, of course, never reach Superman's absurdly overpowered standing, or, well, not for long at least, as we'll see in a bit, but he'll never measure up to Superman's noble morality either. It's this deep-seated sense of self-loathing, shot outwards onto his nemesis, that drives Luthor for much of the story. The first issue sees his latest ridiculous plan to defeat Superman actually work. It also provides us with some of the funniest, whether it was intentional or not, dialogue in Superman comic book history, when the crew member Luthor sends aboard just suddenly remembers, as you do, he's actually a bum in human form. As he says this, as plain as day, with zero subtlety or nuance, as basic and upfront as possible for some extra oomph. Big problem, guys, I've just remembered. I'm an explosive. Needless to say, this man-bum abomination thing is defeated by Superman, which was the point. Luthor makes clear back on Earth that he can feel his own mortality encroaching, and if he has any shot at dying, with even a modicum of happiness or contentment, he simply must ensure his long-time nemesis is on death's door. Driven by little more than hatred, a brilliant mind reduced to twisted, petty evil. Luthor's inferiority complex when it comes to Superman quietly brims to the surface throughout his appearances in the story. His unrelenting mission to get the better of the Kryptonian hero via his intellect and technological brilliance is called into sad question when Superman, under his bumbling, oafish Clark Kent disguise, is sent to interview Luthor on death row in issue 5. Luthor, blissfully ignorant of the fact his nemesis is standing right before him in a minimalist yet remarkably effective disguise, waxes lyrical about his never-ending war with Superman, as well as his increasingly bleak, nihilistic ambitions in life. At no point does Kent seek revenge or let the veil of his average Joe alter ego completely slip, instead making good use of the time to finally get inside the head of the long-term thorn in his side. And despite his blatant psychopathy and hatred, Luthor is surprisingly decent to Kent, protecting him during a prison raid. More intriguing still, and very ironically, he reveals he thinks highly of Clark Kent, specifically because he's nothing like Superman. Kent is a bumbling nice guy, a hard-working geek, with terrible swayback posture that makes him look out of shape, and a generally awkward demeanor. He's the anti-Superman, if you will. The irony in Luthor's take on Clark Kent specifically, because he seems so laughably unsuper, has popped up in other stories concerning these classic characters. Back during John Byrne's controversial 80s run on the character, the big business Gordon Gekko-inspired take on Lex Luthor commissions an extensive investigation into Superman's true identity. A supercomputer traces all manner of evidence, patterns, and statistics to finally uncover that Superman and Clark Kent, golly gosh, are the same guy, who would have thought? Now, of course, you'd expect Luthor to use this information to his advantage and start messing with Clark Kent's life to bring Superman down. Like the Kingpin with Daredevil in Born Again, and by Born Again I of course mean the classic saga by Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli. What is wrong with these artists and their surnames? I most certainly do not mean the Disney Plus disappointment extravaganza that undid much of the gritty intensity and storytelling of the old Netflix series. Or actually, for a more relevant example, Lex Luthor messing with Superman in Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice. What an exhausting title for a film. There, well aware that Clark Kent is Superman's alter ego, Lex Luthor has his mother kidnapped and causes just all kinds of trouble. Here, though, Luthor simply refuses to believe Superman would ever waste time being a bumbling 9-to-5 reporter like Clark Kent. Finally, after a considerable tantrum over the notion that Superman could enjoy living as a normal guy outside of his superheroics, Luthor dismisses the very idea of Superman even taking the time to have an alter ego, begging the question of why exactly he ran these tests in the first place. That frustrated, living in denial approach to dealing with Superman rears its ugly head again in this story when Luthor arranges for Kent to be safely escorted out of the prison. With the interview essentially over, Kent briefly lets Luthor see him without his remarkably effective spectacles disguise, telling him how he and Superman could have been allies and done good together for all of those years. Luthor, staring his nemesis in the face with nothing hiding the truth, doesn't even hint at noticing the eerie similarities between Kent and Superman, instead claiming that their whole beef is actually very simple and is just about Superman foiling his plans for world domination time and again. As readers, by this point, it's plain as day that the rivalry between these two is far from simple. In fact, as the story wears on, it becomes clear that far from a straightforward feud, Luthor is in fact unhealthily obsessed with Superman above all else, and even, hilariously, wants to be him on a subconscious level. Towards the end of the series, Luthor takes that subconscious level up a notch, engineering a plan to enjoy a brief spell as a metahuman, rocking powers similar to Superman's, and teaming up with an actually dangerous alien in the form of Solaris to turn the sun red. Morrison provides a perfect summary of Luthor and Superman's polar opposite personalities in this final confrontation, now with the roles reversed, as a depowered Superman must use his wits and technology to get the better of a superpowered Luthor. Given this story is written by Grant Morrison, there of course has to be at least a hint of a psychedelic experience at some point, a quick bit of ego death to infuse the tale with some otherworldly personal growth for at least one of the leading characters. Old Grant, much like his arch-nemesis Alan Moore, loves himself a trip or two into other worlds, where the mind's eye can wander free and this grey, noisy, prison hellscape reality we consider the norm can take a long-awaited backseat for a little while. For Lex Luthor, sporting the many abilities of his hated enemy provides him with his very own trip, with his senses enhanced, in amongst all of the chaos of combat and destruction. He finally stops to breathe and appreciate seeing the world around him in the way Superman sees it every day. It's a powerful moment, perfectly illustrated by Quitely, as the snarky, vengeful sneer of Luthor's earlier appearances is replaced with a humbled, teary-eyed exterior, as Luthor has an epiphany, feeling that sense of oneness with the world and the people around him that he's likely lacked for much of his selfishly motivated life. Not only do we get to see Luthor have a eureka moment of sorts, but it also sheds light on how Superman sees the world, observing its inner workings and functions in a way a mere mortal simply never could, adding to the wizened, thoughtful demeanor he displays throughout this all-star take. Anyways, this moment of peace for the Metropolis menace is short-lived as his powers wear off, and Superman sends him packing with a couple of punches. Having already sped up, Luthor losing his powers via a gravity gun, enhancing his metabolism. You see, Superman's a bit of a genius in his own right, it turns out. And he notes after knocking Luthor's block off, that if Luthor had actually ever wanted to be a hero or to save the world or to do something right, no one was ever stopping him. The Superman-Lex Luthor rivalry, which, much like the Batman and Joker feud, is a perfect example of a yin and yang war, where polar opposites attract in the worst, most violent way possible, is turned on its head in this moment as we realize Lex Luthor's war with Superman is really his war with himself, as his intellect and ambition clash with his anger and his greed in every waking moment. It's a profound take on such an old and well-established hero-villain story, adding fresh depth to both characters, whilst humanizing the bad guy without stripping him of his menace. With Superman's mortality now firmly in focus, another key aspect of this saga is his mission to complete the 12 Labours. This is of course a nod to the 12 Labours of Hercules in Greek mythology. However, it's not nearly as clear-cut or straightforward as Hercules' journey was. At a glance, given this is a 12-issue story, the obvious assumption would be that each chapter revolves around just one obvious labour. Never one for simplicity, though, Morrison instead provides the reader with a wider-reaching, more ambiguous series of events from which to draw possible labours from. There are some obvious feats that could come under the extraordinary banner required to fit this bill. Superman's deadly affliction stems from the seemingly impossible task of rescuing a spaceship that made it to the sun. He brews a super elixir for Lois Lane to experience his powers, more on that later, and he manages to give a decent answer to what an ancient Sphinx monster assures him will be an impossible question. The exhausting Bizarro World portion of the series also sees him come back from the Underverse, and perhaps most remarkably of all, he effectively creates life at one point as well. Issue to issue, time and time again, we see him live up to his name, pulling off the impossible as he slowly but surely marches towards an inescapable and untimely death. What matters the most when it comes to the 12 Labours is not what actions constitute them, but what the Labours themselves represent as an idea. In connecting Superman to a classic tale of a famed mythical figure, Morrison provides commentary on the notion of superheroes as modern-day mythology. Within the story, in the many years and generations to come, Superman's 12 Labours will allow him to be remembered as a great hero of legend. A mythical figure to draw inspiration from, studied and analysed like the gods of old. In essence, it provides us with a clue as to how Superman will be remembered in the ages to come in his universe, whilst doubling up as a meta-nod to the major pop cultural impact superheroes have had over the years, something that has grown exponentially in the time since this story first started hitting the stands. When push comes to shove in the closing stretch of All-Star Superman, Kal-El must save the Earth by reigniting its dying sun. The man himself is now on death's door already, having just defeated Lex Luthor as his body finally reaches the end stage of his terminal condition. Of course, end-stage sickness doesn't end with Superman keeling over or passing on in a hospital bed. Such a deflatingly sad finale would not suit the tone or the point of this story. Instead, as he has one final moment with Lois Lane, Superman reveals that Luthor using the sun to finally defeat his nemesis has worked in the planet's favour. As his cells convert into light and information, with his body transcending beyond the standard physical plane, Superman is able to go directly into the sun to reignite its heart and ensure life as humanity knows it can roll on unabated. Symbolically, Superman begins to fit the role of a messianic figure within this DC timeline, that his death was essentially destiny, opening up an avenue to save the world he never would have otherwise had. Coupled with the fact he quite literally ascends into the sun in his final moments, Kal-El begins to fit the ancient tradition of chosen heroes dying for their people. And while the story does not reach a resurrection point to complete this cycle, as so many Chosen One type figures across a wide variety of religions and mythologies are prophesied to return after death someday, it does end on a hint of exactly that. We get a full page dedicated to Superman's cosmic spirit living on within the sun, putting it to work so that it may continue to shine. And then on the final page is the reveal of Leo Quintum working on a Superman 2 project, the implication being Superman would, in some way or other, return one day with the help of the man whose saving led to Superman's condition in the first place. Superman's own death here, becoming one with the sun, draws comparisons to ancient religions of old, including Mithraism, an old mystery religion of Rome that revolved around the aptly named Mithras, a godly figure who served as a living bridge between the god of the heavens and the people of the earth. It's worth mentioning at this point that Kal-El, if you run it through a Hebrew to English translation, basically means light of God, and in many stories, including this one in particular, Superman serves as exactly that. A figure of supreme importance in his world, protecting and guiding humanity where appropriate. Considering the heavy emphasis on rebirth, recovery, ascending to the heavens, and frequent dalliances with the sun god's soul, though a litany of Mithraic themes can be found in this tale, if you're inclined to interpret things in that direction. While it might seem like a stretch for a relatively gentle superhero comic book like this one to be delving into ancient mystery religions and concepts, this is Grant Morrison we're talking about here, where everything from Thelemic magic to Dadaism to Buddhist concepts of the Maitreya have made their way into his comics at some point or other. So it's not as implausible as it normally would or maybe even should be. The concept of the light of God is further expanded upon in perhaps the most bizarre moment of the story. Superman, as the clock of his life winds to midnight, wants to understand what a world without Superman would look like. So he just goes and breathes a little bit of surprise life into an underdeveloped new galaxy out in deep space, as you do. And this decision allows Superman to see multiple millennia of human development in quick order, as the world he's created grows and moves at an absurdly fast rate, eventually landing on the key moment Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, him, created the character. A world without Superman, the story basically opens a window through which the fictional hero sees the non-fictional world we inhabit, getting a feel for a place where he's like a mere fantasy for the sake of entertainment. The God portion of the Light of God title is complete as we've just witnessed him quite literally create life, something so miraculous that it must surely fall under one of those mysterious 12 labors much of this story revolves around. Anyways, it's all very heady, and it's just fine to read it as a basic superhero story, obviously.
It's just way too much information for me.
But for those who enjoy looking a little deeper, All-Star Superman is rich in thematic layers and ideas, bolstering and expanding the mythos of Superman in more intellectually stimulating areas than is the norm. As much as Morrison celebrates the fantasy of the Superman mythos, plenty of time is made for human moments as well. These scenes and plot lines flesh out the character and humanize his psychology, helping to largely sidestep the dreaded Gary Stu accusations so often thrown in the direction of overpowered do-gooders. As is customary with Superman stories, his on and off romance with Lois Lane takes center stage in his personal life. This story, released at a time where Clark Kent and Lois Lane had been married for some time in the regular canon comics, with Lane being fully aware of his true nature, stripped it back to the more classical dynamic between them. Much like the 1978 Richard Donner film, Lane here is a feisty reporter with a keen interest in Superman, all while being blissfully unaware that bumbling colleague Clark Kent is one glasses removal away from being the man of her dreams. With his death now firmly planted down the road, Superman is quick to reveal the truth of his alter ego to Lane here. Rather than embrace it or take a keen interest in finally knowing the big secret, Lane initially lives in total denial of the truth staring her blue, no pun intended, in the face. For some reason, the idea of Superman masquerading as Clark Kent day to day is just too absurd to believe. Much like Lex Luthor for Lois Lane, the notion of Superman being content living as an ordinary guy in his downtime is just too ridiculous to handle. As was so delightfully explained in Kill Bill Volume 2, Superman is not the disguise, Clark Kent is.
Superman didn't become Superman. Superman was born Superman. When Superman wakes up in the morning, he's Superman. His alter ego is Clark Kent.
Where Peter Parker or Bruce Wayne throw on a mask to fight crime, Superman throws on a mask to go to work. He lives among humanity well disguised, learning the basics of the human experience, and in doing so is able to check his ego at the door and stay grounded, ensuring he remains a man of the people and not one corrupted by his own immeasurable power. Here, whilst harking back to a more classical setup between Lois and Clark, Lane is not left drowning as a mere damsel in distress for Superman to swoop in and rescue. Instead, their complex relationship develops in surprisingly confronting ways as themes of lost time and longing bubble to the surface. Lane is depicted as a formidable and brash reporter, one obsessed with digging up the truth everywhere she turns. Superman, meanwhile, now finally connecting with her on the honest level he's always avoided, wants her to experience his way of living. Thanks to the aptly, almost too basically named, Super Elixir, Lane is granted a 24-hour ride in Superman's shoes, donning her own costume and embracing his laundry list of super abilities. Less a sidekick and more of a witty partner in anything but crime, Lane and Superman's romantic chemistry is allowed to breathe as they finally interact, without any lies or real boundaries between them. As fun as their earlier interactions in this story are, it's the second half of the saga that really brings to light the importance of Lois Lane in Superman's journey. With every passing issue, Superman's impending death becomes more unpleasantly apparent, creeping up on him slowly and impacting every decision he must make. During this time, as Superman's typically almost unbreakable spirit is placed under more pressure than ever before, Lane is there as his rock, supporting him through the closing stretch of his time on Earth. These moments highlight the heartbreak of the relationship they could have had in the years now gone, desperately making up for lost time as Superman, for the first time in years, Has someone right there with him, understanding the full weight of his burden to carry. In the end, in his final moments on Earth before his condition consumes him, it's hardly surprising that Superman spends them with Lois Lane, with the two professing their love for each other, as the realization this is the final time they'll see each other sinks in. Overall, Morrison takes the light-hearted, fun dynamic of the early days of Lois and Clark's budding relationship and turns it on its head, using a much earlier jumping-off point in their dynamic to eventually throw us head-on into a closing stretch few comics have ever dared go near. Where the Death of Superman story arc showed the toll Superman's sudden, unexpected death opposite Doomsday took on Lane, here we get to watch her support Superman through a more human, more long-term closing period. It's a poignant, sometimes funny, often sad look at one of the comic book medium's most long-standing and recognizable romances. Beyond Lois Lane, another key moment of human interaction for Superman stems from a flashback issue concerning his adoptive Earth father, Jonathan Kent. In issue 6, we catch up with a younger Clark Kent in flashback, still learning the ropes of the hero he will become. The death of Jonathan Kent is typically a key aspect of the character in the film adaptations. In the Donner original, Jonathan Kent keels over from a fatal heart attack, teaching Superman the often sudden fragility of human life in the harshest way possible. 2013's Man of Steel took a very different, considerably more polarizing approach. Kevin Costner's Jonathan Kent is far more cynical than traditional takes on the character, and he frequently expresses great worry in how the world will treat his son when he finally reveals what he's capable of to the public. He encourages his son to play it cool, keep his head down, and act mortal, planting the seeds for Superman's commitment to a double identity in adult life in the process. Far from an unfortunate case of natural causes, Jonathan Kent loses his life here over a dog. Not even a human to rescue. He loses his life over a dog. A mangy house pet is what this guy's existence comes to an end over. Good grief. A twister has blown in and everyone's fleeing their cars to go hide under an underpass or a bridge or something. Martha Kent, did you know she shares, by the way, did you know she shares the same first name as Batman's mum?
You're letting him kill Martha! Why did you say that name?
Martha Kent realizes she somehow left the dog locked in the car before they stepped out.
You're an idiot.
Now, young Clark Kent, who comes from the Dexter Morgan school of just having the adult actor sports slightly longer hair to somehow pass as younger for the flashback, could easily jog over, grab the dog, and run back without raising any real suspicions. His father won't let him though, and instead hobbles over, knees slowed from the torment of getting old, to get that damn dog out, a dog that initially refuses to come to him when he reaches the car. Disaster strikes, the twister is here, it's undefeated. It consumes all that stands in its path, and poor old Papa Kent would sooner die horribly in that storm than let his son jump over and grab him and bring him back to safety. He believes so fully in protecting his son's secrets that he sacrifices himself just to uphold them. Quite dramatic. Would have been better if he died over a little more than an animal that likely eats its own feces, but anyways. Ultimately, that lesson becomes an anchor to Clark Kent, who spends much of Man of Steel living in obscurity, trying to find himself, before the arrival of General Zod finally forces him out into the light, and into becoming the man he needs to be. Kind of a negative father-son dynamic by Superman standards, ultimately. Here, Morrison operates more in line with the 1978 classics take, but with a zany sci-fi flavor dashed over the top. Superman encounters several oddball versions of himself, including the mysterious Superman of the Fifth Dimension, aka Klizizk, Kliznemplugs, Klizix, Klizzant Plugs, boy, I sound like I'm having a stroke here. Klizix, Klizizk, Kliznetplugs.
Well, I'm not even going to attempt that.
As they come together to deal with the Chronovore. And that name is indeed exactly what you might be expecting. A ridiculous interdimensional entity that feeds off of time itself, horrifyingly consuming the life cycles of its prey, turning, for example, the cows that come under its attack into the delicious cheeseburgers they're destined to one day become. Unfortunately, with the dreaded Time Eater out and about, precious moments between life and death are gone without a moment's notice, something this timeline Superman discovers to horrifying effect with his father. Poor old Jonathan Kent has a heart attack. In the heat of the battle with the Chronivore, it hits Superman like a ton of bricks that he can no longer hear his father's heartbeat in the distance. Fleeing the battle, he flies at max speed to his old man's side, desperately shouting, trying to convince himself as much as anyone else that he can save his old man, that he can save anyone in need. Obviously, that unfortunately is not the case, and Superman realizes once and for all, in that instant, that even someone as mighty as him cannot be here, there, or everywhere, all the time, for anyone in need. Everyone's time comes, and in this moment, through the tragic passing of his father, Superman is forced to accept the inevitability of death. Here it's accepting that ugly reality for the world around him, in the present, of course. The reader follows him as he accepts it in his own life. A poignant and hard-hitting issue, number 6 also has an amusing tie-in to Superman's present-day dynamic with Lois Lane. In his formative years, Superman's bizarre, long-running connection to people with double L initials was already in full swing with high school girlfriend Lana Lang. Lang and high school pal Pete Ross form Kent's social bedrock during his adolescence. Ross is typically one of the first people to learn about Clark Kent's extraordinary abilities, something that is briefly but importantly alluded to here. Whilst hanging out at a Smallville diner with their whole lives before them, enjoying a milkshake and questioning what adulthood will bring, Kent must excuse himself when that dastardly Chronivore, whose anatomy is basically just floating mouths and meat parts seemingly, comes to town. He crudely suggests that the diner meal has given him some stomach upset, and perhaps a bad case of the truts is inevitable, even now allowing Clark Kent to seem comical and awkward in the public eye, to throw off the scent of his true nature. The moment Kent is gone, Lang turns to Russ and demands to know why she must continue to pretend she's blissfully ignorant of Kent's true status as a meta-human. Much like Lane in the present, Kent is hesitant to open the truth of his double life up to a potential partner, hesitantly spoiling his own chances with them via committing to the dorky Clark Kent persona 100% of the time, seemingly keeping Lana Lang in the dark whilst being blissfully ignorant of the fact she sees right through him already. As we see in the present, it takes the encroaching presence of death for Superman to finally let the shackles loose a little and fully pursue a romantic connection. This theme is a perfect reflection of the perils and pitfalls of the life a superhero must lead. Their commitments and objectives are so high stakes, and so far beyond the norm of what everyday people go through, that fully committing to the normal half of their life, from work to relationships to even just hobbies, is constantly in jeopardy, constantly forced onto the back burner. Typically, this is more of a key theme in ever so slightly more grounded Marvel heroes' stories, such as Spider-Man or Daredevil, whose troublesome, often frustrating lives outside of the crime fighting take center stage. Here, Morrison offers a quiet take on that key theme of balance, and playing it safe in the most over-the-top of all classic heroes, allowing us to see the human fears and hesitancies lurking beneath the brave, often impressively calm exterior of Metropolis's protector. There are two other key personal interactions worth singling out before we move on. One comes during the more polarizing portion of the story, that being the arrival of Bizarro. Bizarro as a villain has always been the epitome of love it or hate it, where some fans appreciate the campy humor and zany sci-fi on offer with the concept of a quite literally backwards Superman running around and causing trouble, others find it just insufferably stupid. Regardless, it's a classic part of the Superman mythos, and one that's used here to provide a mirror for Superman to look into. Here, Superman finds himself stranded for a time on the cubed hellscape of nonsense that is Bizarro World, adrift among a sea of reverse simpletons. A hellish scenario. Along the way, he meets someone more on his level in the form of Bizarro, a 1 in 5 billion freak occurrence, a Bizarro with the qualities of the actual Superman. Bizarro, while eerily similar to Superman in personality, is the polar opposite in lifestyle and experience. Where Superman is largely celebrated by the public for his heroics back on Earth, Bizarro is wholly alone and outcast, a forward-thinking hero in a damaged, sinister world, permanently stuck in opposite day. For Superman, it's a snapshot in the loneliness his life could have been consumed by, and another strong reminder of the importance of family, friends, and love. All things Superman is fortunate enough to possess back home. Bizarro, despite his grim situation, is quick to commit to helping Superman get back, and even accepts the ugly truth that escape is meant for just the Kal-El of Earth, rather than the both of them. His polite wave as Superman is sent back home sums him up, always noble, always selfless, doing the right thing regardless of its impact on him personally. Proof that even in isolation, even without a dynamic life beyond the Cape to enjoy, the psyche of Superman remains grounded by an unshakably strong moral compass. And finally, one last interaction, the most important scene of the whole story, in fact, not because it charges the narrative forward, or has high stakes or anything like that, no. It's the most important scene simply because it sums up the whole point of the Superman character and what, as a heroic protagonist, he's meant to represent. A young woman stands on the edge of one of Metropolis's countless skyscrapers, teary, defeated. This is all going exactly where you're thinking. A tragedy is about to occur. The struggle of life about to be simply too much for another hapless city dweller. And that's when Mr. Red Cape himself steps in. Addressing her by name, he reveals that whatever kerfuffle there was with her doctor earlier that day was for real. She was not bailed on or ditched or blown off. The doc in question was just unlucky and got held up. In a mere couple of sentences afterwards, he reassures her of her strength to continue on with life, proving there's more ways to save a life than just punching the bad guy in the face, as entertaining as that normally is. This moment alone is a perfect showcase of what Superman means to Metropolis. Far from a bloodthirsty vigilante or a grim, dark figure of vengeance, he's simply the city's guardian, protecting it, but also making time for its people. Keeping an eye on them and stepping in when they need that helping hand. Anyways, moving on. In 2006, a tragedy occurred. No, really. A crime against DC, unfortunately. Its name? Superman Returns. Just 1 year prior, Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins had released to critical and audience acclaim. The film offered a thoroughly modernized, updated take on the caped crusader on the big screen, exploring his psyche, the trauma of his tragic childhood, and how he goes about fighting the scum of Gotham and instilling fear into their hearts. While not a superhero, James Bond, a seminal figure of action cinema, received a similar treatment with Casino Royale in 2006 as well. Director Martin Campbell oversaw a thorough rejigging of the Bond character, taking him back to the gritty, murderous espionage thrills of Ian Fleming's early novels, but transplanting it to a 21st century setting with suitably updated themes and situations for modern audiences to appreciate. The film was a smash hit, and one of both the best Bond films ever made, and in general just one of the best films of the noughties. An absolute masterpiece in character development, action, and world building that set a brand new tone and generation in James Bond cinema.
I know. That's a shame.
Unfortunately, Bryan Singer didn't get the memo when he signed on to bring Superman into the 21st century of big screen thrills and spills. Rather than learn from the success of these updated takes on Batman and James Bond, respectively, he settled for an Elseworlds sequel to Richard Donner's Superman 2 that acted as if the Richard Pryor flick and Superman 4 The Quest for Failure never happened. Instead, we get Superman as a deadbeat dad who ditched Earth to go and look at random fragments of his destroyed homeworld in space, even though fragments of his destroyed homeworld destroy him.
This is bad. Real bad.
Oh yeah, well, I'll tell you, that film was a real slug to get through, let me tell you.
I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed.
And it's even more miserable to watch these days, knowing that every last young man involved in any way, shape, or form with that shoot probably had to avoid bending over at any given moment. Singer and Spacey, the dream team of, hey, what are you doing back there? Taking Superman back to the late 70s in many ways for a miserable, chore-to-watch of slow-paced hokum. The film, while not a flop by any means, was not well received. Its dreary tone, ill-fitting characterization of Superman, painful lack of action, and self-indulgent narrative left many audiences just scratching their heads. Fast forward to the early 2010s, by which point Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, coupled with the budding success of the MCU, had exploded the superhero film genre into a higher level of popularity than ever before. And the DC head honchos were ready to try again with their flagship hero. And the DC head honchos were ready to try again with their flagship superhero. They consulted many comic book writers at the time for pitches on how to bring Superman successfully to life for a whole new generation of cinema goers. Something Superman Returns in 2006 clearly had no interest in. One of those writers was none other than Grant Morrison. Unsurprisingly, his first port of call by all accounts was to suggest a Superman film in a similar style to his All-Star Saga, one that had proven to be a huge hit with readers, critics, and his peers alike. Needless to say, for anyone who saw Man of Steel, his pitch was rejected. What we got was a hit-and-miss action epic from Zack Snyder about a noble but rather troubled and introverted Superman forced into the public eye to save the world from renegade survivors of his destroyed homeworld. The film attempted to provide a very left-brained treatment of the character, that is, one that is practical, sensible, grounded, logical. And while it was a considerable improvement on Superman Returns, it arguably did not capture the true upbeat spirit of the character either. Fast forward to now, and despite his work on the character being moderately well received, Henry Cavill's out. James Gunn has been brought in for the same purpose that Man of Steel initially had: update the character for a modern audience. To try and make as much money as possible out of its name value, and hopefully launch a big, exhausting franchise that just never ends in the process. In 2013, darker, more grounded, more dramatically resonant Superman, stripped of the light fun and hope and the, dare we say, cornier aspects, was meant to be a direct response and counter to the MCU. While the MCU was far from the needlessly comedic, low-tension mess it's become in more recent years, it was already leaning hard on the humor. From Robert Downey Jr.'s improvised one-liners to Joss Whedon's updates to Zack Penn's Avengers script, Man of Steel was meant to be the serious alternative, a direction that was doubled down hard on with Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, still an exhausting title 3 years later. And how the tables have turned.
Well, well, well. How the turntables...
As now one of the pioneers of relentless MCU humor, James Gunn is in the DC driver's seat, entrusted to bring some brightness back to the big blue Boy Scout and reverse the damage done from years of hatchet jobs in the editing room during Henry Cavill's frustratingly truncated run. This video is not actually going to discuss the movie because, as of recording, it hasn't even come out yet. What the emphasis on stories like All-Star Superman for it shows, though, is a faith from creators in restoring a more classical, optimistic view of the superhero medium's most seminal and important character. Not everything has to be dark, gritty, and cool. Some things just fit those bills, and that's great. But others, like Superman, are, by design, a world apart. Hope, peace, strength, commitment to good, and all done with a reassuring wink and a smile, knowing that it's all going to be okay in the end. Everything done the right way. Sometimes that's what people want in a superhero story, even these days. Grant Morrison appreciated this fact 20 years ago. In the years since he completed All-Star Superman, its reputation has consistently grown, allowing it to stand tall as the arguable benchmark of how to write the character. So yeah, an absolute masterclass in superhero storytelling that gets better with age, to sum up.